119,000 kids between the ages of 14 and 16 at risk and disconnected here in Connecticut. How can lawmakers make the right policies to help them? A new commission of communities is hoping to find answers. We're talking to two of the people starting it all this morning. But first, with this short legislative session off to a quick start and communities hard at work moving potential new laws forward, we're sitting down with the co-chair of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, from early voting to libraries and the state candy. Stay with us for this committee close-up. In this week's committee close-up, we're talking to the co-chair of the Government Administration and Election Committee. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. With me now is that co-chair, Representative Matt Blumenthal. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for those who don't know, quick, just give me a little synopsis of what is the Government Administration's Elections Committee. It's one of the longer names, and I feel like sometimes people don't know exactly what you all cover.
That is a great question, because we have one of the vaguest names in the legislature. You know, you think government, that's what every committee does. But we cover a variety of different topics. Obviously, we cover elections and everything voting and elections related. We also cover the structure, processes, and organization of government, particularly related to state contracting, related to freedom of information and transparency, and the structures of different agencies. So we have a pretty wide remit, and you'll see from the bills that we're addressing this session that we're covering a wide swath of territory.
Yep. So the first one you mentioned, obviously covering everything related to elections. And before we get to the new proposals this session, I want to talk about something from last session. Early voting. Voters are going to get to vote early for the very first time here in Connecticut, starting at the end of this month for the presidential primary. There has been, some controversy and confusion, though. The state has put money into making sure towns can effectively and securely do early voting, but every town, no matter the size, got the same amount of money through this. Some registrars are saying that should have maybe been adjusted based on city and town size. Is the committee considering taking another look at that funding structure this year as we see early voting actually go into effect?
Yeah, so the rationale behind giving each town the same amount of money was that each town is required by law to have a single early voting site. And so our Office of Fiscal Analysis examined how much that would cost for each town in terms of all the expenses, and they arrived at this number, which shouldn't need to vary from town to town.
Okay.
That being said, we are looking at providing additional funding, especially related to education about early voting. We want to make sure everyone understands all the ramifications and how it works. And also we're looking to make sure we backstop registrars and town clerks. That, of course, will be part of the budget process.
Because this is going to kind of be the trial election as we see early voting for the first time, right? Do you think anything that comes out of this could, impact what maybe gets introduced next session as we start to see how early voting will actually work?
Absolutely. Every first time, there's going to be some growing pains.
Right.
And we've actually reserved a bill in our agenda for this session to account for any issues that arise during the presidential preference primary. So we will have that ability to address any issues if they come up before the primary and general election.
Gotcha. And, there have been conversations both at the state level and nationally about concerns with absentee voting and its security. Voters really have some serious distrust, specifically in Bridgeport, after that whole controversy and election redo that actually just wrapped up a couple weeks ago. How do you, especially on the Government Admin and Elections Committee dealing with everything to do with elections, how does the state and your committee move forward from here with voter trust?
That is a great question, especially with the constitutional amendment for no excuse absentee voting on the amendment this fall. And we're taking it very seriously. We have several bills that are addressed at the situation that arose in Bridgeport this fall, and potential gaps in our laws that were revealed. We're going to have legislation on election security and transparency. It's going to address the forms of the applications for absentee ballots, when they become accessible, data collection about where different absentee ballots come from, different sort of matters like that, including, and I think this is quite important, enforcement of our elections laws, especially with regard to elections crimes. One of the issues we saw in Bridgeport this fall was that someone was accused of misconduct who had been previously accused of misconduct.
Right.
And then it had taken more than 3 years for them to be referred for prosecution. They hadn't actually been prosecuted or investigated fully. And then now they're accused of engaging in misconduct again. We want to make sure that the State Elections Enforcement Commission moves promptly to refer any potential election crimes to the appropriate prosecutorial authority, and that we have transparency not only at the end of the day on what outcome is taken if there's a prosecution, but also if ultimately the prosecuting authority decides a crime has not been committed.
Right. And moving away from elections now, something people might not realize actually falls under your committee's jurisdiction per se is libraries. So you've been speaking with libraries about a problem you say is wasting taxpayer money. Tell me about how ebooks are changing things here.
That's a great question. So we cover all government organization and also government contracting, and libraries engage in government contracting. And one of the things they've been contracting for is ebooks. So my colleague, Representative Eleni Kakavos-DeGraw, and I have been working on legislation for the past year or so to address this problem where essentially the big 5 publishers who control over 80% of the book market have been charging not only outrageous prices to our libraries, but imposing onerous restrictions on how they can use and lend ebooks. Wow. So you or I, we go to Amazon or wherever we buy our ebook, we probably pay $12 if we don't want it because it's too expensive. Right. We say no. The libraries feel an obligation to get titles for their customers, for their patrons. And so they end up spending roughly 6 times what the average consumer does. And not only are they paying more, but they're restricted in how long and how often they can lend that ebook. So most of these contracts contain a restriction that they have to lend those books only 26 times or 2 years, whichever comes first. Then they have to buy them essentially again. And so they're not only paying a lot more money, but it's interfering with their lending operations and their public serving mission. So we're hopeful that the legislation we've drafted and are pushing will help resolve that issue.
So what would that legislation specifically do? Would that work to, bring down some of those fees, maybe make it so they don't have to pay so often? What would happen there if this passes?
So the legal issues are somewhat complicated.
Right.
It's kind of a lawyer nerd's dream in the fact that it intersects between government contracting, and there is also in the background copyright law, which is federal law, and we can't transgress against federal law. So basically, what we've done in our approach is we have restricted the libraries from agreeing to any of these deals that they've come to us and say are really bad. Right. And so what that does is it binds all these libraries to the mass. They're not tempted to be picked off one by these publishers, by these deals that are expensive and also restricting their operations. And hopefully that will allow them to negotiate deals that are in the taxpayers' interests and in their patrons' interests, and also, frankly, in the author's interests, because I don't think any author wants to be making an extra buck by gouging libraries.
Right. So your committee is also looking at an interesting way to keep local news alive and funded, right? Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So there is a crisis in local news across the country. The business model is broken, and there's a variety of measures that different organizations are trying to take to preserve local news, which is vital to government accountability and transparency, as well as an informed public. One of the things that we've recognized here in Connecticut, and this bill came to us from my colleague in West Hartford, Kate Farrar, in the House, is we spend money on media to advertise for notices, other things related to government. And so what we're saying in our bill this session is the Department of Administrative Services that controls these advertising dollars has to try to use at least 50% on local journalistic sources. Now, this is money we're already spending. We're just saying you have to prioritize sending it to local organizations to try to help them with their economic means. And frankly, it should be good policy as well to get local journalism supported and these notices to the local places here in Connecticut.
Yep. I mean, you don't have to tell us twice. We love keeping people informed. It's our main job. So obviously, a lot of public hearings are happening right now at the Legislative Office Building on the Capitol Complex. We've seen a ton this week as this session moves along. Bills are already being voted out of committee. What would you say to constituents about the importance of paying attention to what's being introduced, to potential new laws, and taking the time to submit testimony? As we know here in Connecticut, no proposal can move through without having a public hearing and hearing from the constituents. So how important is that input for you?
It is absolutely vital. Testimony is taken very seriously by legislators, both live and if it's submitted in written form. And we have one of the most open procedures in the country. We're proud of it. If you sign up to testify, you can come testify, whether remotely on Zoom or in person, and we will sit there until you have submitted your testimony. And so I really recommend people coming and testifying. I can't tell you how many times we've had a bill either be shaped, supported, or rejected because of powerful testimony that's come from a person who just came in and gave us their time and their testimony. And we've got really important bills coming up. We've got bills to protect election workers in this state, bills to try to reform the Connecticut Citing Council, bills to deal with AI, deepfakes, and elections. These are really vital subjects, and we need the insights and feedback of the public on them.
And speaking of, in our last minute here really quickly, you do get to consider some fun bills sometimes and input from people in the state of all ages, like some young people. You're considering bills for Connecticut state dog and state candy. And that's because of some young students writing into the committee, right?
Yeah, so we do deal with all the state, I don't know what to call it, all the state dogs, state candy, all of that stuff.
The state items.
State items, yeah. So, and that's one of the fun subjects. And we do have students coming in and testifying every year. It's a great way for them to participate in the process, to learn about how it works. And again, it's just indicative of how open our process is. My co-chair and I know the ranking members as well, are really supportive of trying to enhance that process, make sure people come in and have their ideas heard. And also, some of these kids have some great ideas, so we're hopeful we'll be able to move some of them forward. Starting
them young, as you said, teaching them how this process works and the importance of testimony. Well, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much, Matt. It's always great to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
But there's still more to come here on The Real Story. We have a lot more to get to. A Dalio report identifying 119,000 youth in Connecticut at risk and disconnected from school, work, and their communities. So what can be done? A new commission is sitting down with communities to figure out just that. We're joined by two leaders, including someone who these challenges have hit very close to home. That's coming up.